Greetings, family, and welcome back to the Freedom March channel, where we celebrate black love and black liberation from the tyrannical grasp of white supremacy. You know, nothing says terrorism quite like police brutality. Nothing says terrorism quite like I'm white and I say so. If I want to kill you, I can, and I can do it with impunity. And the law will back me, subsidize me, and insulate me. Well, what are we talking about today? Today we're talking about white supremacy and police brutality in Minneapolis in its long-standing history that has been around for over 100 years. Going on a century and a half. It's racism, it's systemic injustice and racism, corruption, the Minneapolis Police Department, and more than likely other police departments in the Twin Cities metro area and in the rest of the state of Minnesota, has been corrupt since its inception. Back in the mid-1800s. White supremacy has a lot of tools. And one of its primary tools is law enforcement. Because if you can't instill fear into the masses, then why are they obligated to obey you? Even under the most heinous of circumstances. Well, you need something powerful, loud, noisy, and violent to remind them of their subjugation, to demoralize them, and to keep them from standing up against injustice. And that's where the police stand in. Now, for those of you who are pro-cop and love the police and all that type of stuff, listen. There are good cops out there, all two of them, but the issue isn't that there aren't good cops. The issue is that the good cops aren't standing up against the bad ones. The bad ones are allowed to run rampant. They kill with impunity. That's treason, by the way. Killing American citizens, white, black, or Martian, that is treason. And for them to get away with it, and for other American citizens who call themselves patriots to subsidize and cheer for this behavior, that is also treason against the United States and its people, and its Constitution. You should not stand for a tyrannical police state. You should stand against that. And that's what we do here in Black Empowerment. Now, there's an article that I recently stumbled upon. This is from MPD150.com, and it goes through the entire history of the Minneapolis Police Department from inception to present day. And, of course, this article I believe, was inspired by corruption in the Minneapolis Police Department in 2020 when they murdered George Floyd, when they publicly lynched George Floyd. So we're going to get into this article really quickly. But before we do that, I want to say this. You have to approach this with an open mind. And truth be told, the information is so damning, it really shouldn't be hard, or it really shouldn't be difficult. But this isn't really for the B1 brigaders. You already know this. This is for the Johnny-come-latelys and the no police officers are perfect kind of crowd. This is for these people. The MAGA hat dunce cap wearing fools. This is for these guys. If you are so infatuated with people who wear blue uniforms and a badge, you're probably not going to like this video, but you're going to need it the most. This isn't just to bash cops. This is to tell the truth and to tell it how it is, unfiltered. Look, you can love police all you want. It doesn't negate the fact that their history is corrupt, and most of them started off as slave catchers. Most of these police departments started off having direct involvement with slavery. And with a foundation like that, do you really expect anything that's not corrupt? So please, try to keep an open mind if you're a guest here. This is Black Empowerment speaking, and you will listen. Now, it starts off talking about the past. So it goes in chronological order on this. I'm gonna link the article in the description below. It goes in chronological order, roughly. Starts from the past, back when the Minneapolis Police Department was first made, and then it works its way up to modern day. So, starting at the top, it says, past. The city of Minneapolis wasn't formally established until 1867, of course. The first leader practically begged for a police force to oversee, saying, quote, a mayor without a police force to appoint and regulate would hardly feel that he was mayor. End quote. Now, before we continue, let's focus on that. Translation: If I can't use and abuse my power, what's the point in having it? You shouldn't need to have a group of thugs intimidating people to feel like you're in charge. Being a mayor means you're respecting people and you're being honorable, and you shouldn't need a gang of armed thugs to enforce that. Your honor and your valor and your honesty should be your police force. But I digress. To continue, it says, the city council agreed, of course, and on March 9th, 1867, the first 4 officers were appointed to the Minneapolis Police Department. It's important to note the historical context here. The Minneapolis Police Department was established less than 30 years after Dred Scott and his wife Harriet were held as slaves at Fort Snelling. Yeah, there were slaves held up in northern states, by the way. That really shouldn't be a shocker, but some people act like the North just had its hands so clean of slavery, even though New York City was the biggest slave port in the United States for God knows how long. It benefited from slavery the most. That's why its economy is the strongest. As a matter of fact, its first stock was a slave. Article continues to say, only 5 years after the hanging of 38 Dakota men at the hands of the U.S. government following the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, which they were pushed into because most of their land was seceded and annexed by the United States, and their hunting lands and their livable lands have been taken away from them. They couldn't really grow any food. They couldn't really hunt for anything. Most of their hunting territories were taken away from them. So they were pushed into a corner to where they had to fight, and it ended up costing them the rest of their civilization. But anyway, only 2 years after the Civil War, after the end of the Civil War, perhaps given the department's beginnings, the history that was to follow was predictable. Basically, they're saying because the Inception was around such troubling and corrupt times, it's kind of obvious to see where this was going because it didn't have a stable foundation. The article continues to say, in this section of the report, we will examine the history from its beginning. Starting with the origins of the concept of policing itself. We'll look at the first 50 years of the Minneapolis Police Department and the department's early history as a corrupt political tool. I'm going to repeat that one more time. We'll look at the first 50 years of the Minneapolis Police Department and the department's early history as a corrupt political tool. You're not mishearing that, folks. You heard that correctly. To continue, then we'll move into the middle years, 1918 to 1967, and Minneapolis Police Department's increasing violence towards Black and Native communities, immigrants, union members, and other marginalized groups. Yeah, they didn't limit the discrimination to Black people. Anybody who stood up against their corruption was priority number 1 in terms of MPD's hit list. Anybody who stood up against the natives, immigrants, and union members, which of course we're going to get into later on in this article. And boy, hang on to your bootstraps, all hands on deck, it's going to get ugly. Finally, we'll look at the most recent 50 years, a time of disgrace, militarization, and countless failed reforms at the Minneapolis Police Department. Failed reforms. Why does that sound so familiar? It's like after almost 200 years, nothing has changed, and that's the damn point. Almost 200 years of attempting to reform, and nothing has changed because you can't reform corruption. Corrupt, and especially can't be reformed by other corrupt individuals. And by other corrupt individuals, there's a few people who we're talking about, but the mayor in particular, and we're going to get to why the mayor in specific later. Remember that, because the mayor plays a huge, crucial role in the Minneapolis police departments, and police departments are across the entire nation and the world's corruption. The mayor plays a crucial part in that. Over the past year and a half, we've written a collection of more than 20 short pieces on particularly illustrative stories from MPD's history. These pieces served as the basis for the incomplete history we're going to tell here. If you're interested in learning more about a particular incident in this section, and it has an exclamation point next to it, that means there's a longer piece about it, including citations on the timeline below. Basically, this is just information for the reader. If you want more context on any of the stories, that's what you can do. So, moving on from that. That is of no consequence to you, the listener of this video. So, Section 1, Undeveloped, the origins of policing. We often talk about police as if they've existed for all of human history, when in reality, they're a relatively recent invention. The first modern police force in the world was established in England in the 19th century as the 1800s. Before that, communities were largely kept safe by informal institutions. In 1829, growing levels of property crime caused by urbanization and the creation of urban poverty led to the creation of a police force in London. So the city was growing really fast. They created a peasant class by basically giving people cheap labor, paying people less and making them work more. And then a lot of people either couldn't work or whatever the situation was. And that created a peasantry class that was poor and impoverished. And then when you have poverty, you inevitably have crime. But to continue, the Metropolitan Police Department was created in London, in 1829. Home Secretary Robert Peel was the creator of the department and based it on the model of the Royal Irish Constabulary, a quote-unquote peacekeeping force designed to maintain British rule and control rebellious communities in occupied Ireland. We're going to get right back to that, but let me finish this paragraph. From their very beginnings in London, police departments were rooted in colonialism and the protection of property. Policing's origins in the United States, though, are even darker. So you heard that here. You heard that right here. The very first form of modern day policing in 1829, created by a man named Robert Peel in London, was modeled after a quote-unquote peacekeeping force designed to maintain British rule in Ireland. So when they were invading and occupying a foreign nation, when that nation attempted to exercise peace, freedom, and liberty to free themselves from an oppressive force, a quote-unquote peacekeeping battalion to use violence to crush their rebellions, is what the police was modeled after. They were modeled after controlling people who are being mistreated. That is the origins of policing. That is not peacekeeping, and that is anything but protecting and serving. That is controlling and dominating, and that's what we've seen from the police as a group ever since. That's where the outrage against police comes from. It's not just because people want to beat on cops or people are anti-cop. We understand that being a cop, yes, they have a difficult job to an extent, but when it comes to a dangerous job, being a police is one of the safest things you can be in this country. And that's been proven through statistics. Matter of fact, I'll post it in the video. Now, if you think we were done dragging these terrorists through the damn mud, oh, we're just getting started. Because next in the article, it says, quote, policing's origins in the United States, though, are even darker. It's even worse. It's even more brutal, more sinister, more malevolent, more malicious. The article continues to say, though the 13 colonies imported a system of elected sheriffs and constables who were empowered to enforce some laws, formalized American policing really began with slave patrols. So you had some constables and some sheriffs who were enforcing some laws, but they weren't really the police force. They were more like we will use you guys to maintain some sort of order for now while we're still getting things while we're still cleaning things up with Britain. But policing truly began with the slave patrols, made up of local militias and slave owners who patrolled the countryside, stopping black people and forcing escaped slaves back into bondage. Slave patrols enforced white supremacy from some of the earliest days of the European occupation of the Americas. These patrols and their northern equivalents, town watches, prominent word here being northern. So for those who are going to say, well, the slave patrol, slavery was only in the South, don't you know? I mean, forget the fact that New York and other northern states had slavery before the American Revolution. We're just going to forget about that. Slavery was only in the South, don't you know? Slavery and slave patrol. First of all, the North benefited off slavery even after the American Revolution just as much as the South. Not as much as the South, but they did benefit from it even after the American Revolution. New York has slavery to thank for its powerful economy in the first place. As a matter of fact, the first stock ever sold in New York and in the entire United States was slaves. But even after the American Revolution, the North still benefited from slavery. And they still have their form of slave catchers called the quote-unquote town watches. The word town, the phrase, the compound words town watches sounds a little bit more quote-unquote civil than slave patrol. But the ideas are the same. It was to keep a certain demographic, black people, and in many cases, the red Indians. When I say black people, I'm talking about the black Native Americans and the black Africans who were brought over here, and the red Native Americans also, but to a greater extent, the black ones. It was to keep them in line. But these town watches were empowered to enforce curfews against black and Native folks, as I just said, search and confiscate their property, and brutalize them with or without cause. Total lawlessness from a state that has the audacity to call itself a democracy. These groups were gradually granted additional powers and jurisdiction, eventually evolving directly into modern police departments. So these people weren't even formal forms of authority. They were just random thugs who owned slaves and racists who liked to brutalize people who didn't look like them, particularly individuals who had darker skin. And then they were deputized and subsidized, and then they were empowered legally to do what they were already doing, but now with resources backed by the government. One example of this can be seen in Charleston, South Carolina, a cesspool of white supremacy, by the way, where a town was created in 1671 for the explicit purpose of keeping Native and black people in line, eventually turned into the city's first police department. Now, this is the end of the section for origins of policing. And this is the end of this video. The next video is going to begin with Minneapolis Police Department in 67 to 1917. Now, of course, the article is going to go through their policing all the way up to modern day, being 2022 as the recording of this video. But it's going to be broken down into sections. And the next video is going to focus on those years between 1867 and 1917. This is the beginning of a trilogy, and I really hope you guys are enjoying learning this information about the crooked police up here in Minnesota. And I hope you guys tune into the next video. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, Black love.